What is up, theology nerds? This is Trip, and guess what? Guess what? This is Homebrewed Christianity. That's right, the number one theology podcast on the interwebs. For over 10 years, we've been delivering you the audiological ingredients to brew your own faith. And today on the podcast is Tom Oord. Tom Oord isn't just on the podcast. He's going to be all over the podcast the next 2 weeks because we're having a party of Oord, a Oord fiesta. I don't know how to use his last name and make it relate to a form of excitement. Oord party. But Tom came and hung out at my house. We recorded this live podcast right in the Homebrewed Christianity studio. And then we had a live podcast with our friends at Trinity Lutheran in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, who are hosting the Cosmic Campfire February 1st to 2nd. That's right, that live, exciting event with my friends, Science Mike and Mike Morrell, bringing in Joan Roughgarden, Robin Henderson Espinoza, Barbara Holmes, all up in the house. There's more excitement. You should come. CosmicCampfire.party. That's right, that's the website. Anyway, we got that live episode, and then a brand new conversation I just recorded with him about his book, out this week, God Can't. So, God Can't. That's a title. You'll hear more about it because Tom is not only just a friend, not only an amazing scholar, but he is the man behind the Open and Relational Theology group at the AAR. That's the American Academy of Religion. That's the guild where thousands upon thousands of religious scholars get together and you read papers with lots of footnotes and feel super nerdy. Well, Tom helped put together the Open and Relational Theology group. You're going to hear what Open and Relational Theology is today, and then you'll say to yourself, that sounds awesome. I love the idea where you have like a group that's enough shared in common and yet enough differences to have all sorts of collisions, new creative tensions, that kind of stuff. Well, that's good because Tom and I are starting a reading group, an Open and Relational Theology reading group. And you can join it. You know how? You go to openandrelationaltheology.com. Boom. That's right. We're going to do a 6-week reading group. We're going to read from really awesome people like Marjorie Suhaki, Sir John Polkinghorne, Karen Baker Fletcher, Keith Ward, Terrence Fretheim, Clark Pinnock. And we made a list of so many different people that are open and relational theologians. We hope enough of you sign up for this that it encourages us to keep doing it. And this reading group is available right there on the interwebs, openandrelationaltheology.com. Go there, join up. Consider coming to the event February 1st and 2nd at the Cosmic Campfire.party. And if you are in the ATL, Atlanta, then I'm going to be there at the end of the month of February with my friends from McAfee, which is the divinity school at Mercer University. We're going to be in Atlanta, nerding out with our Geeks Out live. So make sure you follow along, check in on all the events. Go to tripfuller.com. That's Trip with 2 P's, my name. You can go to the Homebrewed Christianity Facebook page and get all the info on events and stuff. You can, follow along on the Twitter and such. But, yeah. Anyway, here is me hanging out with Tom Oord in my office, up late, answering some different questions and topics you sent in. But we mostly have ourselves a good old nerdy time. And don't forget, openandrelationaltheology.com. Come read with us, because reading is good for your brain. And when it's open and relational theology, it's good for your soul. I seem like real confident right there, right? Yeah. The lure is strong with this invitation. What is up, theology nerds? This is Trip, and I'm here with Tom Oord. What's up, Tom?
Good to hang out with you.
Well, we've been hanging out, and now we're going to be answering questions. Questions? How do you feel about that?
Well, give it my best shot.
How often have you been the solution to someone's question?
Me personally?
Yeah.
Probably never. Maybe for my wife.
well, I mean, that's good. That's good. That's always a place to begin. So, the question today is, what is open and relational theologies? So, how do you even begin to answer that question? I know we've had on the podcast a whole bunch of different theologians that fit in that bucket. Yeah. There's all sorts of different things that have happened in the academy using the label, but like, how do you introduce that? Because you're a part of starting the AAR group for open and relational theologies.
Usually what I begin by saying is exactly what you said, and that is there's a wide variety, folks who are pretty conservative to folks who are pretty progressive, who adopt that label, or at least who I think fit comfortably under the broad umbrella of open relational thought. Generally speaking, open relational folks want to believe that God is relational. And by that, I mean the idea that God is really affected by what happens in the world. Our prayers make a difference. Our activism makes a difference. In some way, God suffers with us, to use the phrase that Moltmann has made famous. Mm-hmm. So a suffering God of some sort. And then the openness usually has to do with our understanding of the future, and whether or not things are already determined, or if in fact there's some sort of freedom, indeterminacy. There's some way in which what we do and others do affects what finally is settled when things occur.
So one question that I get a lot is, why in the world is that just one group in Christian theology? Why wouldn't Christian theology be open and relational in general? So when you think of the different thinkers and movements that have shaped Christianity, like, which are the ones that this group is kind of set against or resisting their inertia?
Yeah. Well, I think of the folks that open and relational theologians are at least a little suspicious of, including folks like Augustine, John Calvin. Those two come most quickly to mind. Maybe Thomas Aquinas, but there's certain ways of thinking about Aquinas in which you might think he's relational. Mm-hmm. I personally don't. But oftentimes this group looks to people like John Wesley as a hero. Mm-hmm. Not everybody's a Wesleyan, but he seems to fit that kind of, even though he technically wasn't an open theist, just the way he thought about free will, our relationship with God, a God who's in the midst of things, seeking cooperation, his view of prevenient grace, for instance, to throw in a technical word, those kinds of things lend itself well to a general open and relational way of thinking.
So when did you come to conclusions that, this collection of theologies needed to be named? Like, what about your own biography kind of facilitated you bringing together different theologians, different thinkers, different parts of the church together to go, okay, let's hang out and call ourselves the ORT?
Yeah. Well, I think for me personally, I grew up in the evangelical tradition. Mm-hmm. I'm still a part of that tradition. And if I get to define it correctly, I'll call myself an evangelical, although that's a dirty word in a lot of circles these days. I found things in evangelicalism that I thought were helpful, an emphasis upon Scripture, belief in an actual God who's doing something in the world in relation to me and others. Mm-hmm. Taking our lives seriously, those kinds of things, community. But then I also found in what is oftentimes called process thought, notions that made more sense of a God who is relational, a God who's experiencing time in some way analogous to us, a God for whom we make a difference and the world makes a difference, a God who hasn't predetermined and foreknown everything. And so kind of trying to live in a world of both process thinkers and evangelical folks, I thought we need to have a broad umbrella under which a lot of folks could reside and talk about things we share in common, but also have real differences amongst us.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things that I think open and relational theologies do, or the conversations that as a group in the academy, a benefit of the group is, theologians that are committed to a living and life-giving God tend to be the ones that are also invested in the life of the church.
Yeah.
And when they do theological reflection, the place they're thinking from is not just the academy or their own experience and encounter with God, but if you're a genuinely relational thinker, it's actually the experience of all creation that needs to be taken seriously when you're thinking theologically, which includes all the diversity of humanity, especially those whose voices haven't been privileged and heard over the course of church history. And we got to ask the beasts and listen to creation itself as a very place to thinking and reflecting theologically. That an open and relational theological vision sees the role of experience for theological reflection differently. How would you kind of describe the method or habits of thinking if once you've kind of internalized or swallowed the relational pill, like once it starts to go through you, how does it shape the way you think?
Well, I think a lot of folks in this tradition realize that their own personal experience profoundly shapes the way they think about God and reality. And then when they begin to think about their own experiences, they think about the influence of their parents, their friends, their community, and then that branches out more widely, and they start taking into account the natural world, the societies, the cultures, etc. And they realize that we can't give a good account of our own personal experience if we don't cast our vision widely into what is influencing it and shaping it. And of course, if you're someone like me who believes in God, you think that God plays a role in that, but not the only role. God isn't determining it all. We live in relationship with others, both human and non-human. But I oftentimes think it is some reflection on one's own personal experience that begins to open the door toward realizing how others really affect the way we see the world.
The conversations that take place in the academy and the conversations that take place in the church, theologically speaking, are both ones that you have investment in as just a person of faith and as a theologian. What does it look like to do theology in relationship to kind of both constituencies?
Yeah.
Like as a open and relational theologian who wants to be shaped by your own relationship and commitment to the church, but also to take to account the questions, the criticisms, the put back, the input from the academy. How do you see that working out?
I think theology is done best when it is open to the widest array of experience, and that, of course, includes experience with folks who are developing or at least intentionally focused on the life of the mind, the technical, sophisticated thinking, but also the folks who you live with day to day, you rub shoulders with, you, at least if you're in a church community like me, you hang out with at various times during the week, but especially Sunday morning. And you begin to develop a deep care for those folks. I think also, I personally have suffered some of the negative consequences that come from engaging both the church and the academy. And by that I mean that sometimes when I'm engaging the academy and using language and thought patterns appropriate there, the church listens in through, the internet or various forums and misinterprets, misunderstands, and labels me as maybe even heretical. I've been called that a time or two. And so it's a risk for me to do that. On the other hand, it's also sometimes a risk to be heavily invested in the church and trying hard to use language that's more accessible because you're worried that your scholar friends will sort of look at you as, not really as deeply committed to the academy and going deep in the life of the mind. But for at least for my own part, I think those risks are necessary and the rewards far outweigh the downsides of them. Because at the end of the day, if you really care about the life of the mind, you have to include what's happening in everyday normal kind of life in the church or whatever in society. And just like church and society also need the life of the mind and to go deep intellectually. So to me, it's life-giving to engage both the academy and the church.
Well, one of the things I get when academics have this weird vibe about people that either speak and write and connect with a larger audience. I just have yet to have an experience when I read an academic write a book, right, that a non-professional in that field audience enjoys. I've never met any of them and then started talking to them and realized they actually just aren't that smart. That's as good as they get. Right? Like, I think most people know that if you have invested the time and energy and gained the skills to really operate in a discipline, that does not actually make telling anyone that didn't go to grad school with you about it that it is super easy.
Yeah.
Right? And it's usually because of genuine love and joy, not just for the topic, but for sharing that passion with others or evangelizing about it, that you hone the craft of sharing it.
Yeah. Yeah, it reminds me of a course actually I used to teach on missional theology, in which 7 weeks we would read, technical theological kinds of things. And the last week I had them read a little book called The Best News You Will Ever Hear. It's written at a 5th grade level. And I asked them this question: what is not said in this book that would be an obstacle to some people had it been said? So, for instance, if they had never taken the course, they probably wouldn't have realized that the book is not written with the framework of a God who knows the future, who predetermines things, a God who doesn't have a gender, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. They would have not noticed that I used gender-free language with reference to God, but it's set up in such a way that it doesn't, sort of beat you over the head. Right. So sometimes I think having the academic chops, let's say, helps you just to avoid obstacles for folks. And if you're smart, and it takes a lot of work, you can present your arguments in ways that are user-friendly and also, I think, inspire people.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I know it's hard. Like my experience as a youth minister while being in grad school, you're constantly trying to figure out how to do it. And I thought I was a lot better at it than I really am. That's been my experience. Like I had a friend of mine read my first book and say, I've never read half of an academic book before. And I'm like, what? This isn't, I mean, it's about an academic topic, but like, this isn't an academic book. Yeah. Like, let me give you my dissertation. Yeah. And, I definitely think there's sometimes in the academy, there's a jealousy for those that have figured out how to talk, with clarity and broadly. Yes. In one of the other things that I've really been struck by, how a commitment to both audiences, you could say, in your work, is that you think seriously and theologically about questions that are oftentimes neglected or ignored by a majority of the academy.
Definitely.
That are, if you were polling just your practitioners of cross-religious communities, what are the activities, rituals, commitments, intuitions that most shape their life? So maybe you can share some of that. Like, what was it that, what parts of the life of Christians or experiences or people of faith in general did you think were, under, reflected on in the academy? And what was it like to bringing them to the fore?
Yeah. So 2 topics come to mind. One is the problem of evil, which is a topic I've written quite a bit about. I find that academics have wrestled with this question at some point in their career, and many of them have kind of thrown their hands up and appealed to mystery, or, claim that God is infinite and God's ways are not our ways. How can a finite individual understand the infinite? And then, of course, they'll turn right back around and make all kinds of other claims about who God is, as if they do have some idea of those. So the problem of evil is one that I think just about everybody on the planet asks that question to one degree or another. And I've tried to not only address it head on, but actually make a proposal that solves the problem of evil, not just tries to defend faith in the face of it. The other one is, I think a lot of people wonder if their life really matters. And that's not a topic I hear addressed very often in the academy. And there are reasons for it. It's a very sophisticated question. That would be one of them. But another is, at least amongst theologians, I think they presuppose a certain view of divine power that really makes what we do ultimately insignificant, because a God either controls it all or God could control it all and fix everything no matter what we do. And one of the risks I've taken is to rethink God's power. And as part of that, I think it presents a vision of God and reality which supports the notion that what we do really counts. It makes a difference.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think a lot of people, if you're, I don't know, hyper theological in your context, then the question of like, does my life matter before an ultimately sovereign God, I think is important. And a lot of times the only time they know they matter is when they individualize the death and resurrection of Jesus, for them. And so it ends up with this very narrow piety that is structured, namely, like what matters about you is that you are a sinner and can be something otherwise.
Yeah.
Right. And open and relational theology is one that affirms life mattering precisely because life is a product of God's ongoing relationship with the world.
Exactly.
Like we're working on 14 billion years of awesomeness.
Yep.
And that is like 14 billion years of divine investment in this cosmos to bring about all the amazing and deadly and tragic and joyful experiences we're dealing with. So when you talk about life mattering and what you're contributing to it, like you are contributing to the very life of God.
Yep.
And whether that be, heaven in the future or heaven now or hell now, right? Like, so the question of it mattering. And I think the other side of it, of life mattering that open and relational theology addresses is that a lot of systematic theologians, especially ones that come from more progressive places, have a hard time saying the word God without crossing their fingers.
Yeah.
And so their answers or solutions or dealings with the problem of evil don't just eliminate omnipotence or something on behalf of the perfection of God's love or something like that. But it leads to it kind of reduces religion to an ethical framework, or God has give a more functionalist account of God, but where a genuine holy other is not a topic that's addressed, and then in the silence, you are left with the law without the gospel, essentially, or or the demand for greater investment in activism and all that kind of thing without a kind of rehabilitated understanding of the divine that doesn't have the baggage of the things we're rightly resisting and critiquing.
Yeah, I like that a lot. Yeah. I mean, I even go so far as to say that, the word I like to use is a relational God, but I'm not afraid to use the word personal God. By personal, I don't mean that, God is my personal butler, or that even I don't think God has a body somewhere. Some of my Mormon friends think differently. But by personal, I mean that God has purposes, that God's affected by what we do, that this relationship makes a difference to us and to God, and that, my day-to-day existence counts. Let me give you an illustration of this in my own worship life. I remember as a graduate student thinking through theologically and wondering why it even mattered I sang songs on Sunday morning at church. sing songs about how glorious, magnificent this God was. Was this really just a sort of exercise to remind me of the divine attributes? Was that what worship was all about? And then when I began to think that maybe God is affected by what I do, that God's well-being could be improved because I'm worshiping, it all of a sudden gave significance to this thing I did every Sunday morning, because I wasn't just reminding myself and others of this God that I want to believe in, but also that God could be pleased by my worship, just like the psalmist says. God is blessed by that, and that jacks me up. I mean, that's exciting to me.
Well, and I think there's a certain analogy to any relationship, a loving relationship with another person. I remember, I don't remember when it was, but at some point early in our relationship, I said something in passing to Alicia about, well, I love you. She goes, well, I know, but I want to know. Where it's like, yes, like that's the presumption of everything that structures our life is that we love each other. Mm-hmm. But also I want to know, so you could do things to like demonstrate that reality. And then what happens when you're thinking about demonstrating your love for someone? They occupy a greater space in your life. Yep. Like what it is they do for you, digs deeper into you and things like that. So there's, you could sit and go through the science of what group singing does. Like just group singing, like when you gather with a bunch of humans and you're singing together, your bodies start to flow together biometrically and endorphins trigger that you don't normally do except with one other person. And it's like good for your overall well-being. Yeah. Then what is it that you're giving the attention to when you do it? If it is the story of love that has revealed to you that you're lovable when you resist, then that's a positive thing. Yeah. And so I feel like there's a lot of different ways that like when you're in divinity school and you're learning to be critical of this very same institution and story and experience that sent you there to begin with. Right. Like you can get really cynical. Why are you going to sing that all over again? And, so many people just come here and just go through the motion. Like you get all these criticisms and things, but then like when you develop a robust picture of an open and relational theology, sometimes all those habits serve a positive purpose. Yeah. And sometimes those communities that you can on the surface find plenty of issues with are the very places that are helping to form you to encounter a God bigger than even what they know how to profess.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Yeah. And this notion of a big God, especially a big relational God, I think takes back to my worship illustration and your worship illustration as well. It takes worship far beyond the Jesus and me kind of model. It's just God and me in relationship. Because if you think that God is related to all creation and is both giving and receiving, not just to you, but to all creation, then you, at least, you ought to then think about the things God cares about. My son-in-law, my oldest daughter's husband, is a Green Bay Packers fan. Mm-hmm. I've never been a Packers fan growing up. I was a Seahawks fan and then a Chiefs fan, and et cetera. But now that we've got this son-in-law in the family who follows the Packers, all of a sudden, because I love him, I'm now interested in the Packers. And I'm following, what Aaron Rodgers is up to. How's he going to limp around this week and win another game for him? Same idea with God. I mean, if I realize that God cares about the well-being of not just other people, but all creation, then that inclines me to also care about other people and all creation. And I think that's a really powerful motive, not just in worship, but in the way I live my everyday life.
The Packers example, I think, is a great one. The day LeBron James became a Laker, the number of text messages, Facebook messages, and tweets that I received from people who did not care about the NBA was significant. And people like I've never met, they just listen to the podcast and they know. And like you get this message from a little old lady like in Mississippi who listens to podcasts is like, I don't really like basketball, but I know that's a big deal that y'all got LeBron. That kind of thing to people you know are parts of other teams, and they're like, I'm really excited for you. The last thing I thought about open and relational theology is if you take the open and the relational part, then there's no way that theology is not one that leads to genuine activism and investment in the world.
Yeah.
That when you say, our faith understood most robustly is open, it means theology is actually about hope and resisting the fear that leads to inaction, the anxiety that leads to tribalism, and the deflationary picture of the possibilities available to our world as it's facing an ecological crisis.
Yeah.
Right? Like when we say it's an open and relational theology, that's actually a protest against those who think there is no other option to get off this train.
Yeah.
And in not just is it hopeful because maybe we can talk everyone into doing the right thing. The hope is that God is invested in whatever the world is in this next moment and will promise to be showing up in the next moment. And God always is showing up invested in that moment for love.
Exactly right.
And so to me, an open theology is a hopeful one. Even if half the time when people complain about us, they're like, we aren't sure there's really any hope in your, in your theology. But the openness is a prophetic hope. And the relational part is not just relational in this on God's side, right? But also as we come to recognize the ways in which God has opened God's own life to us, we can start to likewise recognize all the ways we are already related to each other. Mm-hmm. And one of the biggest challenges we're facing as a church and as a religion is how then do we think about Christianity when ethically, when most of our actual relationships that affect each other's well-being are no longer mediated by face-to-face relationship and contact, but by an ecosystem and a market. And what happens when just by being a citizen of a number of nation states who are addressing problems they don't know, right? Like that's our predicament, are simultaneously redirecting large portions of our tax money towards solutions that preserve tribalism and boundaries on nation states and violence and that kind of stuff,
and ruin the ecology and environment. Yeah.
So like when we think if relationships go all the way down for God, then they do for us too, and that gives us a theological center to think about ethics again, because where human ethics evolved, religious ethics in every world religion are like, how do we relate now that there's 120 people and we're not related to all of them? How do we relate when when the biggest allegiance we can come up with, is a nation or a football team, So the open and the relational part, if we take them seriously theologically, simultaneously open us up to the Christian tradition and Christian life in ways that inherited classical theism doesn't.
Exactly.
But it also opens us up to think theologically in, I think in ways that we have to think strategically about ethics.
And I say amen to everything you said. You kind of pointed some to sort of ecological disasters, political problems, and those things. I think I'm committed to trying to see change happen, a positive change. But I think open and relational theology also helps us to remember that just our everyday relationships with our families, with our jobs that we go to, those can make a difference. You talked about resistance, and I think that's important at a sort of political level, but there's also a kind of resistance at the individual, personal, familial, friendship level, resistance to the kind of subtle evils, but also openness to how the small acts of kindness really make a difference. I think about the person who's maybe a school teacher to third graders and is looking at our nation and seeing the things that our president says and the decisions we're making that are only hurting us ecologically. And it's easy to get depressed if you think that your life doesn't matter because you're not in Washington, D.C. But if you realize from an open and relational perspective that what you're doing in your third grade classroom really does make a difference, not only to the world, but even to God, I think that's powerfully important to recognize your ultimate significance of your actions.
Mm-hmm. One of the things one kind of distinction I like to draw to help with that is drawing a difference between what and who you're responsible to and what you're responsible for. Is one of the gifts of a relational theology is recognizing that there is not a monopoly of power.
Right.
Like in each moment of becoming, no one gets to change the past. It's handed to all of us.
Yep.
God, especially as Christian theologians, like God comes as the God of love. Mm-hmm. Offering possibilities. Many of them we don't anticipate and could see on our own.
Exactly.
Right? But they're possibilities of love that make sense in that very moment.
Right. Always contextual.
But so when we think about what we're contributing, like both of those, the power of the past and the power of the divine are already part of it. Yep. So we have to decide what is it like for us to be responsible in that situation. And I think there's a tendency, especially for Christians, when I think of their nation, their family, their church, to think like I'm really responsible for things you don't actually have power over.
Yeah, good
right?
point. Yeah.
And so you get burnt out, you get anxious and all that kind of stuff. And then you can get so twisted on thinking that you have to be the solution to something that even God can't do on God's own.
Exactly.
That you feel like a failure and then you get, and you give up.
Yep.
But you can be responsible to other people.
Yep.
And all creation in whatever ways you can.
Yeah.
Like you could be responsible to them, but you're not responsible for them. Like it's a failure as a parent if your primary concern when you're in public is what people are going to think about you because of what your child did.
Yeah.
Right? Like that if you've been a parent, you know you're actually not responsible for your child.
Exactly.
Like you're responsible for their well-being, but you can't be held responsible for what they say and do. Now, if you are responsible to them on a consistent basis, it will form habits and create possibilities that were not there before.
Right, exactly.
But if you're too concerned about an omnipotent solution at any moment, then you disengage. And so knowing in what do I have the power to do in this moment is all you're responsible for.
Yeah.
And that looks like being responsible to others, but it doesn't lead for the elimination of their subjectivity and their own contribution. And I remember,
or even our own. I mean, I've been talking lately with a person who feels guilty because they're not changing the world. And because of that, they're exactly what you said. They're burning out. And I had to say, look, in an open relational perspective, your own well-being is part of the well-being of the whole. And the way you act toward yourself is really important. There's got to be moments of recreation, of enjoyment, of rest, of things that really are going to make a primary difference to your own well-being and not, the nation. Now, I'm not saying it's one or the other. It's both and. But so often people are concerned about what they're doing for others. They forget about acting for their own well-being, which is part of the whole.
No, I just think of the unnecessary number of times in the last year and a half I've lost my biscuits because I rediscovered our current predicament is exactly what it is. Right? Like, and think like part of the resistance is not giving things you can't change power over you.
Yes, that's right.
Because it leads you to disengage from the very people and places you have influence.
Exactly. Yeah.
When I was a student minister, and all the church came for a funeral of an elderly guy, retired school teacher. When he retired, he started tutoring students and teaching surf lessons for students. And in once a month, he flew a plane. He had a pilot's license. He would fly down and do the same just over the border in Mexico. and worked really hard for anyone that excelled there to get into school in Los Angeles. And then he found mentors. Like, he's this beautiful guy, retired, did 30 years school teaching, and then just kept doing it. Yeah. He loved surfing. He loved tutoring students. And so he died. Like, everyone at church knew him. No one knew how many people he had touched.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, I mean, the place is packed and stuff. And you're hearing all these stories from people. And he wrote a letter for his funeral.
Nice.
And so his wife read it. And he said, "This is your last lesson." And he said, "I want you all to know I never loved more than 30 people at a time."
Interesting.
Because that was his classroom size when he was a teacher. Yeah. And he said, but for that year, those 30 people were the ones I poured myself into.
That's beautiful.
And as a mentor and stuff. But if you were to just look in the room, we know people who that many people are not showing up at a lot of individuals' funerals to celebrate being blessed by someone, because like they didn't realize the exponential outgrowth of what it's like to really show up and give yourself in love to the moment you're in.
Yeah.
And I remember after it looking at a number of the youth who, you know, are sitting there in their senior year, like, how am I going to pick my major? And a number of them here are ones that are like, well, I'd like to be a teacher. Or I'd like to get a parks management degree and help people that, you know, are in poverty in inner city learn about nature and like all these type of things that you think are really cool. And in their heads, they hear their parents going like, "We're not sending you to college to graduate and be on the bottom half of the income scale.
Yeah.
Like, do you know what success looks like?"
Yeah.
And so like after, I was just like, well, he was a school teacher, so you can decide like what kind of success you want. And they're very different. Not that you can't be really successful or anything, but just like his framework and even what happened when he gathered, at his funeral was just to point out, like, most people miss what's available.
Maybe that's a lesson for you, Trip, and for me, and for a bunch of people who are listening to this right now. Like, you and I are at a transition point in our life. We're not knowing what our futures. We never know, but it seems even murkier than ever right now. And in these times, I think it's really at least tempting for me to get depressed, wonder if my life is making a difference, instead of thinking, okay, this is a new opportunity. This is a window here that I probably won't get again. And there are some things I can do that will really have an impact, again, not only on others, but on God. And that motivates me. Mm-hmm. It helps to bring me out of a pity party sometimes.
Oh, man. Yeah. And I mean, one of the things, at least for me, that, like why I've done the podcast for over 10 years.
Yeah.
It's like, in one sense, like, this is a great reason to talk to someone I want to talk to, like you.
Yeah.
Right. And it became a reason for us to end up becoming friends.
Yeah. Yeah.
But, on the other side, I know there are a lot of ministers, that are in congregations that don't know if they can really say everything they're thinking and ask the questions that the podcast became an ally for.
Yep.
There are people that left the only expression of faith they ever knew, found the podcast and found out the church is bigger than they anticipated.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there are people that are, they discover a love for learning and have no interest in getting a degree. And here they are getting to meet everyone you go in debt if you need a degree to do your job there. And so like they'll show up and the first time like we did the process and emergent event at Claremont, well, I don't want to say his name, but, one of my friends that's listened to podcasts a long time is sitting there talking with John Cobb after it. And John said, well, exactly where did he go to school? He has such a firm comfortability with Whitehead. And I was like, he's an electrician. And you know, but what it really meant was he'd listened to all the process related episodes a number of times, and then read their books, and he's got one of those memories. And so he was like, I read Bob Mesley's Introduction to Process Philosophy 3 times.
Yeah.
And I think I got it. And then I read Process and Reality. He would like start texting, send the Twitter DM so what does this mean? And I'm like, I have to look.
Yeah.
This is bad. And he's like, I work by myself. I just like listening to stuff. And, and so there's like those individuals that think of like, because of the way our economy functions, there's a whole lot of people in jobs that sit in traffic and are stuck by themselves all the time. And then they interact and have a community they connect with digitally when they're at their break on social media, and then listen to podcasts and talk with each other.
Yeah.
Like, so for all those people, like what started as a way to get free books and talk to people turned into a really weird community where being nerdy blessed them.
Yeah.
And you're like, oh, I mean, I'd be happy if any of them had a job with health insurance. I'm not against having one. I'm just saying, but there is a sense that, you can forget most people don't cultivate a relationship that matters that much, like that really speaks life into 70,000 people every week.
Yep.
And you just kind of go on and be like, oh, I'm a failure.
Yeah.
So no, and there's a lot of people like that where it takes as cheesy as it is, It's a Wonderful Life moment to like realize there's a lot more there than you anticipated.
Yeah. Your comments there make me think there's another thing about open and relational theology that might make it different from other theologies. And that is, open and relational takes seriously the traditions that have been handed to us, but also very seriously the present and where each of us sits and our experiences. And yes, there's important ideas to learn from the past and from those who are wise, but there's also things that we can contribute to the conversation that go beyond sort of memorizing what the ancient wise people said, that this is an ongoing conversation. It's not complete and will never be complete. And the electrician has some contributions that we all need to hear. I think that's pretty important.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. So, if someone is, interested in digging deeper into open and relational theology, what 3 books that would you suggest as a way of like describing the diversity, the theological spectrum and the tonal styles? So
let me just assume that the person we're talking about doesn't have a master's degree in religion. Okay.
Oh yeah. No, that's probably.
So I think
you can do 2 lists: a potential PhD student and
I think a book I often recommend to people just kind of beginning to think in these ways, who especially maybe have come from a Christian background, an evangelical background, is a little book called God of the Possible by Gregory Boyd. Mm-hmm. And in that book, he looks at scriptures and begins to tease out the implications of the possibility that the future is open for God. A second book I might recommend is one by Catherine Keller called On the Mystery. And Catherine's a very sophisticated thinker, and she usually writes pretty technical books. But this particular one is written for a broader audience, and she takes some of the themes of process thought and makes them pretty accessible. So I recommend that book. It's called On the Mystery. Third book, I would recommend one that I co-edited with Karen Winslow and Brent Montgomery called Relational Theology, an Introduction. It's an edited collection of very short essays, I think 1,000-word essays, mm-hmm. taking relational theology and asking questions about the church, ethics, doctrines of God in very understandable kinds of ways. So those 3 come to mind.
I was thinking, if I couldn't pick any of those 3, I love Bob Mesley's Introduction to Process Theology.
Yeah.
One, because it's extremely clear.
Yeah.
And 2, the last chapter, he's like, but I'm also a naturalist.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a wonderful example of what open and relational theologies do, is that he gives one of the most clear introductions to the process stream of open and relational thought. And then at the end is like, and I have a very significant disagreement, namely about the God part.
Yeah.
And so the conversation's big enough to include the one who loved all the chapters but the last one and the last one.
Yeah.
Right? Like that's one. Moltmann's Trinity in the Kingdom of God is I have a love-hate relationship with the doctrine of the Trinity in general.
Yeah.
But in Trinity in the Kingdom of God, of all the different ways Moltmann kind of develops his key insights, one is the shortest. 2, his understanding of the relationality of the Trinity in that text is built out of Jesus' own piety. So his kenotic self-understanding, like his own pattern of discipleship, how it's shared among the disciples, and then how you enter into it in the life of the church. And so what that book does in ways a lot of the social Trinitarian books don't is actually say that the life of the church is giving you the very life of God to participate in a deep, a very, very deep way. And I love anyway, we don't have to say a lot, but that I find is the most compelling of Moltmann's books. I mean, Crucified God's like the one that,
everybody
like,
sort of
shakes you straight, but, and I think the other one would be, what's that, one, Quest for the Living God? Yes. Elizabeth Johnson's book.
Yep.
So Elizabeth Johnson is a open and relational Catholic feminist who, when we did the session with her at AAR, is like, when I do metaphysics, I'm very process friendly.
Yeah.
But I have these other commitments, and we're like, yeah, that's why you're open and relational. Like, like the things you love Whitehead for are the things that's called open and relational theology. But what she does in Quest for the Living God, is, especially if you're new to theology, is she uses the image of the church gathering around a campfire to tell stories. And each chapter are all these new expressions of Christianity, not new in the sense of they've never existed before, but they've been given permission to speak. Yeah. And so the first chapter sets the stage as basically like Karl Rahner and Catholic mysticism and Vatican II and stuff, and the mystery of a transcendent deity. And then after that, you get like black theology shares the experience, and then like feminist theology, Mujerista theology, like, and what you see in the book, that other than you're introduced to all these different voices, is the book is framed, namely that to be a Christian would be to be transformed by all of these conversations, even if they're not where you locate yourself. Yeah. And so I think part of what an open and relational theology is one that sees itself as when you engage difference, whatever it is. Yeah. Like you're engaging to be mutually transformed by each other. Yep. And the image of where you do theology across difference being like sitting down and hanging out, as opposed to like in a church board meeting, a heresy trial, or really boring papers with footnotes. I just love the image of it. And she's such a clear thinker. And then at the end, she's a good writer, kind of frames it, that, and by the way, the planet you're living on is one, y'all should probably really learn to talk better so we don't, mess things up. Yeah. Yeah, that's I also really like Creative Suffering of God. Oh, by Paul Fittis. Yeah. But that's probably,
it's a little technical.
It's probably nerdy. Yeah. And the other, like, for a theologian that's never read open relational stuff, Daniel Day Williams' Spirit in the Form of Love.
Sure. That's a powerful book. Yeah.
It's I imagine among the closest to like an actual 1-volume systematic theology written in an open and relational perspective. Yeah. That's intentionally so. Maybe Ted Peters would count. What do you think?
He doesn't really have an open future, but he writes in terms of the creation being open and that sort of way. Yeah. But he's got a Pannenbergian, prolepsis sort of eschatology.
It depends on who reads. Let Phil get it open for you. That's the.
Oh, really?
Well, no, I think like how you read, like how much determination does the like in what way does the prolepsis determine things?
Yeah.
I think that's an extremely nerdy thing not to put it into a podcast, but just to say, what is being revealed proleptically, like, is our future assured because the destiny is revealed, or the infinite promise of God's fidelity?
Yeah, well, that's very different. Yeah.
No, they are different, but I really feel like a lot of times open and relational theologians will end up parsing the wrong differences because they forget they're all talking to each other. And but anyway, because even a prolepsis in a Greek piece of theater, it's a revelation of the end, so you can actually understand the present with meaning.
Yeah. Not
like as you're watching the rest of the play, like when the chorus comes out in a play and the prolepsis of the play happens, the everyman of the play, the chorus tells you, oh, here's what's going on.
Yeah, yeah.
But it's not, the revelation of the future is for the purpose of understanding and experience the present properly.
Yeah.
And
I suppose it matters a lot on how detailed that revelation is. If it's a revelation that suggests that things have been settled, all the details have been finalized, then it's hard for me to see how the present matters. But if the prolepsis is the image of the final victory and the details aren't spelled out, there's not the kind of guarantees you get with a doctrine of God that has the kind of omnipotence that makes all kinds of problems, then I can embrace that.
Well, I don't know what Ted thinks. I've taught his book a number of times, and the future of the world.
Yep. Yeah,
but then the new edition came out, and he reworked the whole eschatology section. I haven't read the new one, but I do think there's but he's like a variation of those social Trinitarians.
Yes.
And and for open and relational theologians, they're at least adjacent.
Yeah, well, I think there's some open relational theologians who are really strong advocates of the social trinity, others who are very suspicious of it. So on that particular issue, I think there's plenty of room for discussion in the camp under the umbrella.
Oh, yeah. And yeah, well, I'm not going to keep, I don't know why prolepsis came up when we were trying to, that's like, nerd heaven. It's just debate Phil. Just debate Phil. Tom doesn't like prolepsis. He's very concerned. He doesn't even want to use the word. He's allergic to it. He's breaking out in hives.
I had a conversation with Wolfhart Pannenberg one time. It took literally 45 minutes at least just on that one issue. And, so when I hear the word prolepsis, I think of it in terms of Pannenberg, and maybe that's not fair to others who use the word, but that's how I think.
Oh, no. Well, I don't think Pannenberg lacked clarity on what he meant by it. I just feel like there's a lot of people that are they're Moltenbergs.
Interesting. They're Moltenbergs.
Like usually your personality finds Moltmann or Pannenberg more attractive.
Yeah.
Like deep down, I would rather write the books Pannenberg wrote, like where he picks a discipline, reads everything he can.
Yeah.
It takes a very strong thesis, engages it, argues it, and
it's impressive.
Like, yeah. Like in, like that. And I like reading books for people who are like, I don't know, Moltmann is much more poetic on things.
Definitely.
Where he takes a doctrine or a conversation and then I feel like he goes, what are the 3 worst expressions of this in church history? Now I know what I have this intuition now. How would I articulate one of them? Cause you can't rehabilitate it. And then now how would you re-articulate one so it contributes something in the positive? And then like, what's this misunderstood thing that I'm going to rework. And so like his whole way of framing has to do with these creative vignettes with different moments in history and stuff. And then he's like, how is all of these doctrines secretly about pneumatology and eschatology? And if we realize that every doctrine is eschatology, because Bart said it once and didn't follow through, then now we're going to work stuff out.
Yeah.
And I know people who, like, how do you see a real relationship between Ponenberg and Moltmann? I'm like, there's a lot of things that it's really like one is like a classic rock band and the other's a symphony.
Nice, yeah.
Where like the aesthetic of reading them is not related.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And how they think is not, but their conclusions are, get them put together so much that a lot of Americans that read them both, they're Moltenbergians.
I love it.
All right. Talk to you later.